How can early life trauma lead to a life of addiction?
Mhm. So, yes, this is, the
I mean, we talk about
yeah.
people wanting to escape the trauma, escape the pain,
Mm,
things
mhm.
like that. But like, I'm sure that you can dig deeper than that.
For sure. And now it's shocking, honestly, that we're, 2023, and we know so much research about how early life trauma changes the brain and renders and can render an individual vulnerable to substance use disorders. And yet we don't really ask this in doctors' offices, right? When we're patients, like general practitioners, we don't really look at some of these experiences of early life trauma because it is one of the best predictors of later life, not only mental health, but also physical health outcomes. But what we know, scientists know it does change the brain. We don't really know the how, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But ultimately, what science knows is that when you experience these highly traumatic events, and they can be acute, they can be like one-off experiences, so experience of extreme sexual abuse, for example, or they can be chronic, so experiences of neglect, poverty even is considered a chronic stressor. What science knows is that um, these highly stressful experiences do what they're meant to do, which is to activate the brain's stress centers, right? And the so-called fight or flight responses. And so what's happening is the brain is saying, recognizing that there is a threat, alerting all the neural resources to say, hey, there's a threat here, we need to cope with it, and ultimately initiating that fight or flight response, which leads to a cascade of hormones throughout the body as well as neurotransmitters in the brain to cope with that threat. With these experiences of early life trauma, they're so stressful, they're so the amplitude is so great that ultimately what it does is it kind of turns on key brain regions that are involved in consolidating memories related to fearful events, so that everything in the brain is really about avoiding that threat or that stressful circumstance in the future, learning to avoid any stimuli, things in the environment that are even associated with it. So the smell of somebody's aftershave, for example, with
Hmm.
a sexual abuse, the sight of somewhere, a dark alley where you might have been attacked, and so on. And what that does is over time, you can imagine that the individual is always on high alert, right? You're hyper vigilant. You're kind of always like being watchful, mindful of when that threat could happen. And so scientists know that one of the things that one of the outcomes of early life trauma is it ramps up the activities of the brain involved in processing fear.
Mm.
And so we know that this leads to somebody constantly feeling unsafe. And the other thing that happens with early life trauma is it ramps down the activity of other parts of the brain that are involved in coding for reward